out of the operating budget, and the unmarked cars tend to have a much longer life, calendar life, and should be a capital item. So that's kind of the distinction there. And that has been practice for the most part, if not policy. Our funding preference is pay-as-you-go, so that we would either pay for it as a capital exclusion or out of free cash. Obviously, that's not going to work with big ticket items. And on big ticket items, you're looking at either a debt exclusion or non-exempt debt in all likelihood. What the town and the boards need to look at when we're looking at any capital acquisition is the debt capacity of the town and the future capital needs, and that falls back into the 10-year plan. So you can look out and not be blindsided by major capital needs that are coming down the road and approving something this year. So it's got to be a pretty cohesive look at the needs and to take our capacity and future needs into consideration. And the final item on the underlying principles is that we maintain a stabilization fund of 5% of net revenue. We're not there yet. That would be somewhere over $2 million. We're not at that point yet, but that's our goal. The Finance Committee has set a set of evaluation criteria that we would look at, and it's on page 3 of the full document. I won't go through all of those, but it looks at the needs, who's being served by the acquisition of the capital item, why we're doing it, is it an emergency, and various other criteria. Debt management is addressed in the policy. There needs to be a clear identification of the funding source to satisfy the debt, not just in the current year, but over the life of the debt. Again, that falls in line with a 10-year plan that we've got some sense of where we think we're going to be in the out years before we commit to something in a current year. Use of betterments where appropriate, so that if it's something that we're doing that is impacting only a small portion of the population, to the extent allowed under Mass General laws, that we follow that and have those bettered by the project pick up at least some part of the cost of that. We would, in managing debt, we would like to see the debt service on non-exempt debt not exceed 2.5% of net revenue. So roughly $1 million plus a year, so not to penalize the operating budget any more than we have to, because that's where the debt service on non-exempt debt comes out of the operating budget. And a maximum maturity of 30 years. In an earlier version, we had this at 20 years. We bumped it up to 30, thinking in terms of what may come down the road into school, and it makes more sense to have a little bit more flexibility in there on the time period that we would fund a project. In the document, we talk about free cash and define what free cash is, where it comes from. I don't need to go through that at this meeting, but it's in there so that anyone reading the document and looking back to where I mentioned in funding options that free cash is one of the methods of paying it currently, that you know what free cash is, and that anybody reading it knows what we're talking about. We also talked about, although it's not necessarily part of the capital improvement project policy rather, is the reserve fund. This is the fund that the Finance Committee has to deal with extraordinary and unforeseen items. And finally, we talk about the stabilization fund. The idea behind the stabilization fund in a perfect world would be that we would set a fixed amount in our annual operating budget for debt service on non-exempt debt. To the extent that the non-exempt debt service that year is more than the fixed sum that we set aside, it would come out of the stabilization fund. To the extent that it is less than what is set aside in the fixed, that amount would go into the stabilization fund. That way you can keep the stabilization fund at a fairly healthy level.
Could you clarify, when you're talking about stabilization fund?
I'm talking about capital S, destabilization fund, not the
Stabilization.
yes.
This is the capital.
This is the stabilization fund, not the capital stabilization. We're not addressing that at all in this policy.
Is there any particular order you're talking about funding these things?
I'm sorry?
We've got the funds all set up. It's a question of any reserve, cash reserves we have. Are you talking about funding the stabilization fund first, the capital stabilization fund first?
Stabilization fund first.
Not the debt stabilization fund.
This is addressing stabilization fund, and I say in an ideal world, what we would do is we would in the operating budget set aside annually a fixed amount that would be used to service non-exempt debt. And to the extent that that is not sufficient, then the stabilization fund would be used to meet the deficiency.
That's what we're doing with
what we're doing with the capital stabilization.
Right, that's what I'm asking. Which one do you want?
We're talking
first,
about,
or are you talking about eliminating the
the other one, I don't know what its life is going to be. I mean, it's pretty well tapped out now. So I don't think that's going to be around for a long time. So I'm not even addressing that in this policy. Okay?
I understand.
Okay.
I agree, but yeah, I understand.
The couple of caveats on the stabilization fund is that it is not to be used for operating budgets, that a maximum of 1/3 of the budget can be drawn down in any one year, and that our goal, as I said before, is the stabilization fund should get to 5% of net revenue. We're not there yet, but that would be our goal, is to get it there and then kind of hold it at that level.
Don,
Yep.
I want to come back to this minimum value, and I know that you explained that obviously we couldn't jump down that path.
Yep.
Going up. But I'm thinking of, I'll just use some numbers. A $20,000 copy machine, if there is such a thing these days, right? That, let's say, the town administrator wants, and the only way we can put it in the budget is, we can put it in his budget, but we need to borrow for it. So in the omnibus article, you can't have anything there that says you're borrowing. Follow me?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it ends up in the capital budget.
Or it's funded out of the operating budget, and it's not borrowed from.
There is no funds available. We need to borrow that money. And
You
we
need to
the
borrow that money if you can't plan for an operating budget to deal with items of under $25,000 over some period of time.
You would probably suggest that they lease it for 3 years or 5 years.
Well, leasing is also a capital item, and you're going to lease it and
Well, I'm just saying that way there, all you're responsible for in that one particular operating budget is 1/3 or 1/5 of the payment that's required, as opposed to, I mean, you're borrowing the money, it's just a different mechanism of borrowing.
that's exactly right.
You know, it's just a different mechanism, and I guess to the
And
chairman's
probably a more expensive mechanism.
question- Right, but it's the only way we can afford the equipment that we need.
It's the only way you can afford it if we can't come to a discipline that says that items of $25,000 or less, we pay it out of an operating budget. I mean, if you've got a $5,000 limit on there, then you know you're going to be putting into capital things that you don't necessarily want in capital. The other thing is you may not need to borrow you could use free cash for that $20,000 copier.
That's fine, and I guess what I'm trying to think of.
In every statement, you're making the assumption there are available funds to cover it. I'm saying if there are no available funds to cover it,
Mm-hmm.
you
Which we
decide
found
it's an
ourselves in.
item that's needed.
We've been there before.
Yeah.
We're there a lot.
What I said earlier was that we see this as a goal.
Yeah, okay.
That is a reasonable thing that on a long-term basis, that we ought to have a high enough value set for items that are capitalized and that we borrow for. And currently, you know, $5,000 seems to be a kind of a cutoff, and that's much too low. We're not going to move from 5,000 to 25,000 in 1 year. We may not move from 5,000 to 25,000 in 3 years. But I think we ought to have as a goal of moving there, getting people thinking about it in those terms, and trying to structure the operating budgets to do that. I mean, right now, I know there's no more money left in operating budgets to do barely anything, but I think we ought to have a policy that says that's where we're headed.
In my thinking, okay, I would put a timeline goal and make it in steps of, you know, maybe it's 5,000, and anything over 10,000 in 2013, and then anything over 15 in 2015 or whatever.
Mhm.
Because I think having a realistic goal from a planning point of view, we have a much better shot of making that really happen. Because now we're integrating these costs into the budget more slowly than we would otherwise.
And that's what we anticipated in the policy, but a timeline could be put into it just as easily as, I mean, that's, we recognize that you can't make that leap in 1 year.
And I guess what I'm saying is, rather than keep it soft,
Put some definite dates in there. That's fine.
definite dates
that
with
may make
dollar
sense.
amounts.
Yep, that's fine.
And since we're reviewing it annually, it can be adjusted annually to see if we can meet those goals or not. But in one of the,
That was our thermostat that just fell down. We may need to purchase a new one.
Sorry,
unforeseen.
you're out of luck.
Unforeseen.
Unforeseen.
Nothing to do with you.
No, but, you know,
It's a budget
I just wanna
buster.
make sure that, you know, we don't get into a conflict with someone who, say, on the finance committee, who's dogged about this and is just reading this rigidly and saying, hey, I'm not approving anything here. You know,
That wasn't
I
our
know
intent,
it's
and I
not.
think putting in timelines is
With the
fine.
timelines in which could be reviewed on a regular basis too, to see how,
Yeah, and I think it gives us a little more honest incentive. When it's open, you say, well, yeah, it's not gonna happen. So we just continue doing what we're doing.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
If I
Mr.
may.
Yule.
Yeah.
looking at the motion, the motion is basically saying that we would adopt this policy. All right? So we're going to have, if you're going to amend, if we are going to vote on this right tonight, we have to amend the motion to reflect the changes.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to
That's
do
it.
that.
yeah, but we could put that up for another night too. In other words,
Fine,
this is
fine.
but-
But I don't want to go on and say we approve the plan and we have something rigid, so.
And just the other thing, getting back to the capital stabilization fund, which we don't know what its life is going to be. I think it's been extremely useful tool for us. It's also been a source of revenue for the operating budget off and on too here. But, you know, I think it was a great idea and a good concept and something that I don't necessarily see going away soon. I wouldn't want to see it go away soon.
Yeah, in
because it,
fact, Don, I would comment on that, Steve.
I would
is
like to
that
see it incorporated.
You're applying the same concept only to stabilization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think opening
It's
the
been
door
key
to
to
the
us.
stabilization fund is a mistake. You know, and say, okay, if debt is above this amount, because that's what we've been doing with the debt stabilization fund. I'd rather see us work harder to get some money back in there.
I concur.
And continue to use that and keep the stabilization fund whole. Not against putting more money in the stabilization fund, by the way.
Well, how would you fund the debt stabilization fund then? I mean, that was a.
Because we've
Oh, oh.
already drawn a line,
Yeah.
okay? we said any